Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Handege Wash Process Kenya from Sweet Bloom Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Sweet Bloom, based out of Lakewood, Colorado. And before we start, I wanted to share an anecdote from this past week when I noticed my friend Connor post about the same coffee. So I reached out to him to get his opinions on it, and I got a lot of interesting feedback, not necessarily about this coffee, but about Sweet Bloom in general, as he kind of mentioned that they're a coffee roaster that really inspired him when he first started getting into coffee. And it's no secret that they're probably our biggest inspiration, having grown up about a mile from their coffee roaster, and as a result I got an opportunity to try pretty much every coffee that they released for a 4, 5, 6 year span. And they're the coffee roaster I'm the most familiar with out of any coffee roaster in the entire world. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why we get so much more feedback and questions about Sweet Bloom than any other coffee roaster. It's because we rate them so highly, and I think this is a great opportunity to kind of demonstrate why their coffees might set themselves apart a little bit more from its contemporaries, both back then and especially now in a very crowded coffee market. Looking forward to discussing that, as this right here is day 22 of this coffee. Recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 204 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Sweet Bloom is a light medium American for the roast profile. With those things out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 7, first impression, and it was actually a lot more savory than I had initially expected. So obviously I have a lot of familiarity with Sweet Bloom's Kenyans, and they are the Kenyans that I grew up with, so as a result I typically know what to expect with them. And they're not quite as savory as most other coffee roasters that do release Kenyans, especially of the SL28 variety. So as a result, I was a little surprised, but not too surprised in the sense that Sweet Bloom doesn't always give off the best first impressions with their coffees. It's usually from that first time you try it to the second time that you see the most improvement. So having a very Kenyan-like base to this cup of coffee wasn't necessarily the worst thing ever, but it wasn't going to leave the best first impression, as I could detect some additional red fruits, but for the most part it was a vintage Kenyan cup, very savory dominant with that infamous T-word, tomato. So not necessarily the best first impression, but I knew we were probably going to see better results from this point going forward. And that was certainly the case with day 9, as there was huge improvement, as there was much more of a cherry candy forward profile from this point and this point going forward, as it was quite reminiscent of what I would describe as the red cherry starburst. It was quite nice. The cup still does maintain a fair bit of its savory base, but I was seeing a pretty significant increase in sweetness, especially relative to that first impression. Already a much better impression of this coffee. Day 11, another great day for this coffee, as I'm experiencing big cherry sweetness to it. The cup maintains its very savory base with a slight bit of the savory herbality to complement the really big sweetness, but there has been improvements to the cup in general, and as well as it when it does cool down, as there's a slight citrus and a slight sugary background to this coffee. So very nice couple of days. We continue. Day 12, ran it through the Chemex, and this is why I don't necessarily prefer to the Chemex, is I experience a lot more of the savoriness through the Chemex. The super cherry forward cup has perhaps a bit more of the herbality to it in this way as well. So those two things, which are probably my least favorite things about Kenyan coffees in general, were kind of taking away from the overall enjoyment. A little bit more of the citrus brightness really shines as it does cool down, with a slight bitterness too. So still a very nice cup of coffee, but definitely not the same sort of experience as I had through the V60. Day 14, cup has been unusually robust today, and I think this was a brewer error, as it was especially robust at these kind of higher temperatures, so just off of brew. A slight bit more of the darker sweetness in the cup today. It does cool down, and it has a little bit less of the herbality to it, so that was a positive, but for the most part the cherry felt a little bit more neutral, so it was nowhere near as good. My biggest objective for this coffee was to really accentuate the wonderful cherry sweetness that was coming from this cup of coffee, so that right there was not it. Day 16, I felt the cup had actually kind of possibly peaked, as there hadn't been much improvement in the last few runs. Was seeing a slight decrease in the overall savoriness, which was good. However, it was continuing to feel cherry dominant with a little bit of the darker sugar, but not quite to the same extent as I'd experienced on some earlier days. And then day 18 was back to seeing some significant improvement, and here on day 22 I've also seen some improvement. So it kind of went in a little bit of a roller coaster, where it got really good, it had a couple of down days, but then it got good again, and I think maybe it was from a little bit of experimentation to see what I might be able to get from this coffee. But back to day 18, it has two really distinct aspects to it yet again. A slight bit of the Kenyan savoriness that does cool off into a cleaner cherry fruit chew. Again, kind of that starburst aspect. So yeah, definitely had that Kenyan savory base, definitely had a lot of that cherry, two most noticeable and abundant things in this coffee, but given that the cherry was a little bit more dominant and pronounced in this, that was a big selling point to me. So let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were experiencing. And 3 level 4s. Let's go through those real quick. The finish at a level 4, it does have a very sort of Kenyan finish, does have a little bit of that savory herbality to it, so that's up there. And then the berry fruit, the cherry, which I've been mentioning a lot throughout this video at a level 4. Those are the two first things I wanted to discuss, as, I mean, they're pretty straightforward. It's the sweetness that I find the most interesting thing and the thing I must discuss the most. So it is at the lower side of level 4, but as I kind of alluded to at the start of this video, what is it that sets Sweet Bloom apart from a lot of its contemporaries? I feel like I've had a lot of similar Kenyans to this with other coffee roasters, and more often than not, the highest I could ever chart them in terms of sweetness is at a level 3. This one, while on the lower side of the level 4, is just a little bit sweeter than the other ones, and that right there is a nice little factor that sets it apart for one reason. And we're going to touch on the other two reasons, which are right next to it as well. The acidity, and typically when it comes to Kenyan coffees, they're kind of acidic tomatoes, and as a result, the acidity typically is up there at level 4. This does have a fair bit of acidity, but as you can see, it's slightly toned down there at that level 3. And especially at brewing lower temperatures, this could go down even further. I like it at that 3 mark. I think that's kind of ideal for this coffee. So that right there is another reason. And then the third reason is the cleanliness, because I've mentioned before, I have a really hard time charting Kenyan coffees above a level 3 in terms of cleanliness. This right here does reach that level 3 mark, but it definitely is on the higher side of the level 3. So I know it seems like it's very small differences, maybe a slightly higher sweetness, maybe a slightly higher cleanliness, and a slightly lower acidity. But for me, that actually makes a world of difference when comparing two coffees side by side, as I think that's what really sets this Kenyan apart from a lot of its contemporaries, at least in my opinion anyway. Let's go through the rest of the tasting wheel though. I don't think that there's too much else worth discussing, but we'll go through it as well. Body level 3. It's a Kenyan coffee. It has that infamous juicy body. So yeah, that's very much there at the level 3. The savoriness, I think that helps that it's kind of bumped down to a level 3. It's definitely level 3 though. I can't bump it down any lower. It does have a fair bit of that classic SL28 Kenyan-like component to it. The florality, level 3. I think the savoriness does go with those two kind of things. It does have the tomato and it does have a little bit of the herbality. That's why the florals are a little bit higher than I think I would have expected. Kind of interesting they don't have a floral flavor note listed on here. I could definitely go with that infamous red flower, the hibiscus that I experienced from so many Kenyan coffees. So that's definitely there for me. Anything else? Slight bit of bitterness, slight bit of smokiness, probably attributed to a slightly more developed roast profile relative to some really, really light Kenyans. But for the most part, I don't think that there's too much else worth noting. I think this is a really good representation of what I was experiencing from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. One thing I really wanted to highlight was that our next review is also going to be a Kenyan coffee from Sweet Bloom. It's the Karandundu. And I felt that these coffees were best being drank side by side because that's the way I reviewed both these coffees, was drinking them on the same day, one right after another or one right next to the other. So I think it'll make a lot more sense when discussing both of these coffees side by side to see why I liked both of these coffees as much as I did. But this one right here, I've kind of demonstrated why this one is a better Kenyan than a lot of the other Kenyans that I do have throughout the year. So this one was a really good drink for me. And it just does kind of go to show just how much I do enjoy Sweet Bloom's coffees. And I'm not always the most complimentary of everything that they put out, but I think that this was a really nice Kenyan. And I'll probably go a little bit more in depth into that with the next review as well. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think if you are a classic Kenyan lover, because it definitely still has that tomato kind of savory red base to it, but it does have a little bit more sweetness, a little bit more clarity to it, and it's very strong on the cherry. So if you specifically like your cherry forward Kenyan coffees, I think that this one's a really nice fit for you. I saw continued improvement towards the end, so even though it felt like there was a little bit of that roller coaster where it took a little bit of a dip, I've definitely seen significant improvement day 18 onwards. So this coffee does have longevity to it as well. I think all of those factors make it a really nice and definitely above average Kenyan coffee in general, and this is coming from somebody that notoriously doesn't love Kenyan coffees. I think for the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Handege wash process Kenya from Sweet Bloom Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.